Thank you, Professor McCarty. And I should start by saying how happy I am to be here and to be part of this exciting new department of Global and International Studies and to be working with all of you wonderful students. As Professor McCarty was saying, I've already taught global political ideologies. I'm currently teaching global social movements, and I've really enjoyed the conversations with students in those classes. So today I'm going to be talking about the global threat of race and the decomposition of struggle. I'm going to be talking primarily about a number of cases in the United States, in Europe, in Libya, and in South Africa. And more than anything else, I'm going to be focusing on the year 2011, which was a year of tremendous uprisings around the world that we'll get into shortly. But part of what I'm going to be arguing is that in these fascinating series of uprisings, there was insufficient attention paid to the global threat of race, something that eventually contributed to the demise of many of these movements and opened the door to state repression and right-wing co-optations of these movements. So let's start with where we're at right now, the current global conjuncture. Arguably, the last 10 years throughout the world have been defined in large part by the 2008 economic crisis. This was a crisis that started in the mortgage sector in the United States. Many people lost their homes, right? Millions of people had their homes foreclosed upon. But it quickly spread to many other sectors of the American economy and to the broader global economy, such that it kind of set off a debate about whether this represented a crisis of neoliberalism, that term that we used as a stand-in to describe the last 40 or so years of global political economy, or whether this was a broader structural crisis of capitalism itself. So we've been living in the wake of this crisis as it has endured up into the present, and we haven't fully recovered, not only in the United States, but in other parts of the world. Nonetheless, immediately after this crisis became apparent in 2007 and 2008, we began to see a series of movements that were operating in the context of this global crisis, right? There was a global spring of protest, something I'm calling the global spring. Originally, it was called an Arab Spring after the Arab uprisings that really set off this sequence of struggle. And a lot of these struggles were fighting against forms of authoritarian rule, the extreme levels of inequality, right? Massive unemployment, forms of austerity, where governments responded to the crisis not by helping people who were unemployed, right, who were struggling to find work, who were saddled by debt, but by cutting benefits in an austere fashion. That's what austerity means in an economic context. So the prescription for the crisis of neoliberalism was more neoliberalism, right? And that's part of what the movements were protesting. They were also protesting state violence. Now, what we've seen in the wake of the 2008 economic crisis and then the 2011 uprisings that have emerged around the world is really a crisis of liberal centrism, right? That dominant political ideology that has produced some amount of consensus around the world for a long time, right? Certainly since the modern age of globalization began at the end of the Cold War in the 1990s and the 2000s, right? Liberal centrism, the belief that the individual is the center of society, that your rights should be accessed on an individual basis, right? That you should have a free market society. These ideas were dominant so much so that they produced a kind of neoliberal consensus. And the context of the 1990s was called, for this reason, in some senses, an end of history, right? The idea behind the end of history was that there were no more great ideological battles to be had between left and right-wing political parties, political movements, because now the whole world could embrace a kind of liberal, centrist, free market, open society where the great political battles would be in the past, and now we needed technical managers of the economy and of our political systems, right? That's why for a long time people began to see no big difference between two ruling political parties. Instead of being called a left and a right wing, you heard the terms center left and center right, right? because many of the two leading political parties throughout the world adhered to these centrist principles of liberalism. Nonetheless, what we've seen in the last 8 to 10 years is that hegemony of liberal centrism coming under crisis. It doesn't mean it's gone away. Doesn't mean it's lost. Far from it. It's still extremely powerful. But it's opened up space on the left and the right for new political formations. And that's why now is a particularly exciting time to be studying global political movements, because it's a time when there are tremendous possibilities, but also tremendous danger. So, in the wake of the 2011 uprisings that we'll get into shortly, arguably we've been living in our current moment in a context where the pendulum has swung to the right? And we've seen a wave of new forms of authoritarian, right-wing populist authoritarian governments and fascist movements coming to power, People thought they had defeated fascism after World War II, but clearly that's not the case. And we've seen this in a number of places throughout the world. These movements emerged often in response to the left-wing movements of 2011. So in the United States, we had the Tea Party first, and we currently have the Trump administration. In Brazil, there was a coup against the center-left Workers' Party. Their leader, Dilma, was taken out of power. In her place, Michel Temer stepped in, and then Jair Bolsonaro. This is an extreme right-wing leader who's openly called for a return of military dictatorship in the country and the need to wipe out all the so-called deplorables who are a stand-in, kind of, for the racialized, impoverished communities that live throughout Brazilian cities. In Saudi Arabia, you see the consolidation of power by Mohammed bin Salman. So this right-wing authoritarian turn hasn't just struck democratic societies, it's also hit monarchical or already authoritarian societies where power is being concentrated even more in one or just a few hands. It's going on in Israel with the Likud party and Netanyahu's attempts to hold on to power and his open embrace of some of these right-wing governments throughout the world like Trump and Bolsonaro in Brazil. It's been going on in India with the ruling BJP party, a Hindu nationalist party under the leadership of Modi. And in Egypt, in the wake of the Arab uprisings, after there was an opening, a call to get rid of the old regime, not only did the old regime come back, but it was yet again someone from the military, a general, Sisi, who has managed to hold on to power. And all over Europe, you've seen the return of far-right, both fascist and right-wing populist authoritarian political parties and their militias being emboldened. Now, South Africa, which has been a focus of much of my research, in a sense prefigures this broader global trend, I want to argue. Already in 2007, the African National Congress, which has been the ruling political party since Nelson Mandela came to power in 1994, when the country had its first post-apartheid democratic elections. This ANC was taken over by Jacob Zuma in 2007, and he ruled until 2018. And his government, in a sense, mirrored a lot of this populist authoritarian turn that we've seen take place in many other parts of the world. He made an appeal to everyday people, denouncing formal education as something that the elites did. He used extremely patriarchal language to mobilize support. When he was accused of rape, he appealed to his traditional cultures to say, if I want to have access to a woman, I don't need to ask permission, in a sense. And he appealed to a militaristic logic, arguing that in the anti-apartheid movement, he had been steeped in the logic of militarism and of force, and that's really the kind of strongman politics that South Africa needed to take itself forward. So we're going to get into a little bit some of these cases I spoke about, and I'm going to end with the South African example at the end. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what I'm calling this global threat of race, which is a term I'm drawing from David Theo Goldberg. And in his book, The Threat of Race, he makes a number of arguments. The first one is that we can't think neoliberalism without thinking about racism, right? Many of the theorists, especially the early theorists of neoliberalism, right, were trying to understand the profound political and economic changes that began to spread all over the world, beginning in the 1970s, prominently in the 1980s, under Reagan and Thatcher's governments. But they did so in a way that really explained it in kind of economistic terms, right? How did the economy change? As though it was a racially neutral shift in policy. And what David Theo Goldberg wants to argue is that you cannot understand the shift in neoliberalism without understanding the threat of race as a constitutive part of the shift to neoliberalism. He also gives us a sense, in a kind of very cursory fashion, but nonetheless that's useful, I think, of the history of forms of anti-racist struggle. And he says there have been three prominent phases of anti-racist struggle throughout the world. The first one beginning with the Haitian Revolution, and then throughout the 1800s, was an abolitionist movement, right? The struggle to overthrow slavery. The second great period of anti-racist struggle he discusses lasts from the 1920s to the 1960s, and it centers around the decolonization movements, right? Countries all over the world fighting to overthrow the fundamentally racist structure of colonialism, coupled with the civil rights struggle here within the United States. And the third phase he talks about lasts from the 70s to the 90s, where you had the centrality of the anti-apartheid movement, the appeal of this movement around the world that garnered so much solidarity with other people because of the sympathy that we needed to overthrow an explicitly racist governmental structure. And in the West, the rise of multiculturalism. Now, although he situates that in the context of anti-racist struggle, the supposed call to embrace a multiplicity of cultures and peoples from all over the world, he's also quite critical of this idea of multiculturalism, arguing that it has the potential to operate as a kind of colorblindness, right? A neutral category that can erase the specificity of race under the guise of diversity, right? Now that relates to a central problem that he uncovers in all of these struggles, and that is a shift from anti-racism to anti-racialism. Whereas many of these movements began by targeting explicitly structures of racism throughout the world, they often eventually shifted into anti-racialism, which is a term he uses to mean the desire by people to get rid of the category of race altogether. Right? There's a concern that simply by using racial categories to name our groups, our identities, we're somehow giving life to something that has no biological truth, no reality. And so some people argued that we shouldn't even use these categories because to do so would be to kind of bring out racism and give it life when we shouldn't admit that it exists if there's no such thing as race biologically. But he's critical of that shift to anti-racialism because he argues that, yes, we know that race doesn't have an essence, right? But racism does. And that's something that Ruth Wilson Gilmore has argued in her own arguments about race. She says if race has no essence, racism does. Racism is singular because whatever its place-based particularities, its practitioners exploit and renew fatal power difference couplings. Racism is a practice of abstraction, a death-dealing displacement of difference into hierarchies that organize relations within and between the planet's sovereign political territories. Right, this is a really useful and fine-tuned definition of what racism is and why we can't escape race as a category. Right? We can't fall into anti-racialism because we need these categories in order to fight racism. So where does South Africa fit in all of this? Well, some scholars, like Gillian Hart, have argued, as I was arguing earlier, that it fits quite nicely, unfortunately, into this broader context of a global threat of race and openings on the left and on the right. Here's how Gillian Hart describes South Africa. She says it's an extreme, but far from exceptional embodiment of forces at play in many regions of the world. 1, massive concentrations of wealth, alongside the mushrooming of wageless life, or what an administrator of the Bundesbank calls populations with no productive function, right? These are unemployed people, surplus populations with no prospect for employment in sight. 2, oppositional politics that are assuming a multiplicity of forms. The Tea Party in the United States, explosive Hindu nationalism in India, widespread anti-Muslim and xenophobic sentiments in much of Euro-America, the reemergence of fascism in Austria and other parts of Europe on the one hand, right, that's the right-wing version, and on the other, the uprisings in the Arab world, the Occupy movement, and the anti-austerity movements in Greece, Italy, and Spain. And 3, official efforts at containment, ranging from liberal biopolitical interventions targeting specific populations, often in the name of security, to increasingly common police brutality and rampant militarism. So all of these elements that define the broader global conjunctures, she says, are present in South Africa, right? South Africa is emblematic, in a sense, of these shifts. So let's come back to these 2011 uprisings that I want to use as case studies for my argument. For those of you that may not recall, some of you may have been too young, 2011 was an unbelievable year of global uprisings. All of us were glued to the TV, at first to Al Jazeera, as we watched as every day a new country had a massive uprising. At one point, there was such a large protest in Egypt that they said 30 million people were in the streets. That's 1 in 3 of every single Egyptian, right? And then it spread from country to country to country, right? Things kicked off in December of 2010 when a young fruit vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi was trying to sell his fruit. He'd been attacked by the police multiple times, told that he didn't have a permit to sell his fruit. He grew so frustrated, he was humiliated that he didn't have access to make himself a living. He was trying to create a job for himself out of nothing. He lit himself on fire and later died from his wounds. Now, this single act of protest by one person ignited a broader global sequence of struggle. First in Tunisia and in Algeria. Within weeks, there were protests by people who had watched the video of Mohamed Bouazizi and for whom that somehow struck a chord. They identified with his plight, right? They had been living for a long time with unemployment, under repressive governments that humiliated them and couldn't provide for their basic needs. And so they took to the streets demanding the fall of a variety of different regimes. And by the middle of January, the Tunisian president, who had been in power for 23 years, was forced to resign. So within a month, somebody who's been there for 23 years is gone, right? That set an example for many other people around the world. First of all, in Egypt, but then in Syria, in Jordan, in Oman, and in Yemen, and other Arab countries who were reading their Arabic news and following what had happened in Tunisia. Thousands of people took to the streets to denounce their own government. By February, the Egyptian president, who'd been there for 30 years, was forced to resign, right? And also that same month, protests erupted in Bahrain and in Libya. By May, this spread beyond the Arab world, and you had protests and occupations of public squares throughout European cities, most prominently in Spain, in the Puerta del Sol, and in Greece, in Syntagma Square. There, they were protesting against their government's austerity measures, against the solution to neoliberalism that was more neoliberalism. And in June of 2011, I attended a general strike in London whereby public sector workers, students, called for a massive strike whereby thousands of people refused to go to work, held a protest, demanding that the government not impose greater austerity on an already indebted and impoverished population. By August of that same year, riots broke out just outside of London in Tottenham in the wake of police violence. And in September, we had Occupy Wall Street in the United States. So what we may remember retroactively as just Occupy Wall Street, in fact, came at the end of a long series of protests that had erupted around the world. And the activists who went down to Zuccotti Park in New York to occupy it, to denounce what they saw as the injustice of the solution, the so-called solution to the economic crisis of 2008, which was to bail out the banks, right? So many of these bankers were let off the hook while they were indebted as everyday people. saddled with increased forms of student loan debt, credit card debt, medical bills that they couldn't pay. They might have been laid off in the wake of the economic crisis. They might have lost their job, right? And they didn't see any of the people at the top of society, who they called the 1%, paying the price. They saw them further enriched. So they occupied Zuccotti Park, just like people had occupied Tahrir Square. By October of that year in Libya, the Libyan leader who'd been in power for 42 years was overthrown and killed. And the next February, the leader of Yemen, who'd been there for 22 years, was forced to resign. This was a tremendous period of uprising that really continued and continues in some sense up to the present, but which peaked in this year. So the argument I want to make, though, about this time period is related to what I was telling you about the loss that liberal centrism has had of its hegemony, of its ability to set the terms for politics, right? And now liberals in the center have to work alongside new forms of right-wing politics and new forms of left-wing politics, right? And in many cases, what we've seen since this 2011 uprising, which is the pendulum swinging to the right and populist authoritarian leaders and fascist leaders coming to power, has been something that people have been horrified by in certain sectors and just want to point the finger and blame, right, these crazy supporters of the right wing. But part of what I'm arguing is that we also need to look at our movements on the left. We have to look at those left-wing movements to understand that part of the seeds of reaction and the threat of race that's been mobilized by these populist authoritarian leaders and political parties were also present in these left-wing movements from 2011. They were insufficiently grappled with, right? And we could see that already in Occupy Wall Street. So Occupy Wall Street, as I said, began as an occupation of Zuccotti Park in New York, right down by Wall Street, a denunciation of the banking system, of the finance system, and a demand for greater attention to the plight of everyday people, right? That occupation spread very quickly. You had occupations all over the country, in Los Angeles, in Portland, in Seattle, in Austin, Texas, in Houston, in Atlanta, in Baltimore, in North Carolina, right? Almost every single major American city had a small occupation where people set up tents, occupied public space, and started to say, we're not leaving until we get together and decide what we're going to do about our debt, what we're going to do about the fact that we can't find a job, and what we're going to do about the fact that we see so much inequality. Right? And there was this sense, right, this slogan that they rolled out, that it was emblematic of the broader world uprisings, right? That there had been inequality for a long time, there had been forms of state violence and authoritarianism, but that the 99% was now waking up, and that's what we were seeing around the world. They used all kinds of interesting forms of political organization. When the police took away their ability to use microphones, like I'm using now, or bullhorns, they merely repeated the speeches that people were given using a human microphone. So you see that here. People were standing up and repeating what someone was saying in a speech or a comment in these assemblies that they had, where they tried to decide what the purpose of the movement was and what they were going to do. But you started to see tensions emerge already in this 99% as this broad category of the excluded, of these oppressed, right, of the indebted. And part of that emerged in the context of the encampments themselves. People wanted to stay in the camp. They wanted to make a statement, just like activists had in Tahrir Square and other parts of the world. But once people set up their tents, they noticed that there were other people there, either already there, homeless people, right? People who may have been struggling with substance abuse and who only have one place to go, which is these public parks, or they were attracted to this gathering of people, saying, oh, what's going on? Sometimes there's some food there. Sometimes there might have been a clinic set up for the occupiers. And so there was a kind of division between people who saw themselves as being there for a legitimate cause, as part of the struggle, right? Most of whom, although not all, might have been white, middle-class college students, and many other occupiers who were then painted as illegitimate occupiers, right? Homeless people, right? Who were seen as leeching off the movement, not contributing to it, being a problem. In Los Angeles, they even created a divide at one point where the illegitimate people were told to go over there and the legitimate occupiers would stay over here. And some people who may have been suffering from homelessness themselves picked up on the logic of Occupy and said, yeah, occupy Skid Row. We've been occupying public space, right? Because we don't have a house. But somehow the movement was unable to recognize that as a part of their struggle in many cases, right? And that was a very racialized division, as some activists who were a part of that struggle pointed out. Another thing that began to happen in the course of these occupations was they were met with police violence, right? The police came in, told them they either couldn't occupy public space any longer or they couldn't hold a protest, and the police were quite rough and violent with many of the occupiers, again, many of whom were students. And these images of police arresting, tackling, beating protesters then began to go viral, and they garnered a lot of sympathy, right? In many people's eyes, these were just innocent students occupying, denouncing the fact that they had too much student loans, and why should the police treat them with such degree of violence, right, when their cause was supposedly just. And even within the movement, you see here, there was an attempt to reach out to the police in some sectors, saying, police, you should join us. After all, you're part of the 99% too. And in a sense, that's indicative of what some people argued was a slight version of naivete on behalf of the occupiers, who hadn't necessarily been met with this kind of police force in the past, the way that other communities often experience police violence directly on a routine basis in a way that up until this point didn't really garner much public attention. Another example of this was in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, where occupiers decided to squat in a building that had been abandoned and they tried to turn it into a community center. The local SWAT team was sent in, and you had this picture that went viral of semi-automatic weapons being pointed at these activists who just wanted to serve food out of this abandoned building, and that's why they'd occupied it, right? So there was this immediate kind of contrast of state violence and otherwise innocent occupiers. Another example of this, you may have seen this, took place on UC Davis's campus, where students also joined in the occupations. They had their own protests, their own shutdowns, their own demands related to student debt, related to a whole range of things. But they were also met by violence from the police, in this case from the campus police. And this image became so emblematic of a society that supposedly was out of touch with itself, right? That it would send the police to pepper spray students who were just trying to demand some form of justice on campus, some participation in their education, right? That it spread all over the internet, and UC Davis even tried to wipe the internet of all these images. They hired a PR firm, and that's what this image somebody has produced is trying to indicate. They wanted to pepper spray out these images, in a sense, from the internet, because it made them look so bad. So many of these issues, right, the fact that you had this division within the Occupy movement, and also there was kind of a coming to consciousness of state violence only in the occupations and not in relation to other communities who had already suffered forms of state violence, were brought to light by some of the occupiers or by people who attended occupations to try to open up a dialogue with them. And one such person was Jamal Crawford, who was a local activist in Boston. He'd been active in South Boston for quite a while with different communities, principally Black and Latino communities there. And he decided to attend the Boston encampment in October 2011 to address them. And he said, look, I normally wouldn't come to an occupation like this when I look out at the room and I see faces that don't look like mine, he said, right? Pointing out the fact that this is a principally white audience. But then he said, I came today because we're sympathetic with your movement. We understand. We think you're on the right track. But I want to open up a little bit some of the issues that you've been talking about. I want to expand the breadth of the issues you've been focusing on. First, with regards to police violence, he said, I understand they had just been beaten in Boston by the police. He says, I understand, and I give you credit for facing the police. But then he says that's a drop in the bucket compared with the state violence that my communities have been facing. And you haven't really addressed that as a pre-existing condition in a sense, right? I understand that you're denouncing the banks and you've targeted Bank America for having gotten us into this crisis and for having profited from this crisis. But I don't hear anybody linking the history of Bank America to the slave trade, right? And the fact that it's being named in a reparations lawsuit. So he was trying to insert into the discourse around Occupy questions around racism and the centrality of the threat of race to neoliberalism that was being denounced, and in a sense calling out the movement in a gentle but also forceful kind of direct way for ignoring these issues. In a sense, he was making an argument that Jared Sexton makes in his piece, People of Color Blindness. There, Sexton says, "This is why every attempt to defend the rights and liberties of the latest victims of state repression will fail to make substantial gains insofar as it forfeits or sidelines the fate of blacks, the prototypical targets of the panoply of police practices and the juridical infrastructure built up around them. Without blacks on board," says Sexton, "the only viable political option and the only effective defense against the intensifying crossfire will involve greater alliance with an anti-black civil society and further capitulation to the magnification of state power." Okay, let's shift to Europe. In Europe, as I mentioned, you saw a wave of anti-austerity protests that picked up off the Arab uprisings. Here you see a picture of Madrid, Spain, where in May, thousands of people occupied the main plaza, Puerta del Sol, to protest against austerity and to demand real democracy now. There was a recognition that the systems of representation had broken down, right? Center-left and center-right parties were two sides of the same problematic coin. And in London, you had a call for a general strike, which was answered by thousands of people who refused to go to work on June 30th, 2011, and took to the streets to denounce attempts by the British government to tinker with their national health system, right? They have universal health care over there, and the government was threatening to kind of erode it, to make cuts in it. They were increasing the price of school tuition, right? And they were threatening a lot of people's pensions. So you'll see that as a big demand at this time. Don't solve the crisis with more imposition of neoliberal austerity. But 1 month later, in early August, Mark Dougan, who was a young black man in Britain, was killed by police in Tottenham on August 4th. And in the wake of that example of police violence, riots broke out, first in Tottenham, and then they spread all over London, right? People were looting stores, they were burning cars, sometimes breaking buildings, right? This spread all over London in a matter of days, as people sympathized immediately and were really angered by yet another example for them of the threat of race as it was embodied by the British police in their killing of Mark Dougan. But this second form of outburst was not covered the way the first form of anti-austerity protest was. And we see here in the British press the way that these rioters were depicted, right? Police hunt for Twitter rioters. So they just got a tweet from each other and decided to go riot, right? Willy-nilly, right? There was a sense of labeling these people as criminals, as the downtrodden, as the really problematic sectors of society who had no political claims whatsoever. Yet again, you had a distinction between the quote-unquote good, moral, respectable protesters in the anti-austerity protests and the problem children that were these rioters in early August who were really ignited by an example of police violence. Now, this division between a kind of recognition of the need to address austerity in Europe, right? The need to attack governments for imposing austerity on everyday people, and the ways that if you didn't, this would fuel the right-wing, anti-immigrant, racist hysteria of right-wing parties. This was recognized by many people, and Slavoj Žižek, who's a philosopher, in his book on the 2011 uprisings, acknowledges this, right? He does understand that there is this specter of a right-wing threat. And he describes a version of this threat in Greece by saying, imagine a scene from a dystopian movie depicting our society in the near future. Ordinary people walking the streets carry a special whistle. When they see something suspicious, an immigrant, say, or a homeless person, they blow the whistle, and a special guard comes running to brutalize the intruders. what seems like a cheap Hollywood fiction is a reality in today's Greece. Members of the fascist Golden Dawn movement are distributing whistles on the streets of Athens. When someone sees a suspicious foreigner, he's invited to blow the whistle, and the Golden Dawn special guards patrolling the streets will arrive to check out the suspect. This is how one defends Europe in the spring of 2012. So Zizek was very aware of the opening on the left and the right that these protests represented, and he was aware of the rise in racism that was spreading all over the European continent, including in Greece, where you have an openly fascist political party patrolling the streets, handing out whistles and saying, if you see a foreigner, migrants from Africa, blow this whistle, we'll come take care of him. Right? That was daily reality at the time. Nonetheless, he's unable to link the struggles from those same communities with the broader struggles against anti-austerity protests. He sees them not necessarily as political subjects, apparently. And that's clear by his analysis of the UK riots. He says that although the UK riots of August 2011 were triggered by the suspicious death of Mark Dougan, it is generally accepted that they expressed a deeper unease. But of what kind? Similar to the riots in the Paris suburbs in 2005, the UK protesters had no message to deliver. The contrast with the massive student demonstrations of November 2010, which also turned violent, is clear. The students had a message: the rejection of the government's higher education reforms. This is why it is difficult to conceive of the 2011 riots in Marxist terms, as indicative of an emerging revolutionary subject. Much more appropriate here is the Hegelian notion of the rabble, referring to those outside the organized social sphere, prevented from participating in social production, who are able to express their discontent only in the form of irrational outbursts of destructive violence, or what Hegel called abstract negativity, right? Here, Zizek is conjuring up, out of context, an argument that Marx made in the course of the 1848 revolution in France, whereby Marx argued that the fact that the peasants and the lumpen proletariat, those groups of people who lived in the city but didn't have access to formal jobs, had sided with the royalty, right, was proof that we couldn't trust these classes. They weren't part of the formal working class that was organized and is the proper subject of struggle. So Zizek is taking that analysis of Marx of 1848, pasting it 160 years later onto the present, and saying, see, look at these rioters. They're disorganized, they're outside what we would call our organized society. They only know how to act out of irrational violence. This is not political. So on the one hand, Zizek is representative of the broader context that I'm arguing we have to grapple with, right? He sees the threat of race present in Europe, right, in the wake of these austerity measures. On the other hand, he can't see the very same subjects of that racism, people of color in Europe, migrants, right, people who are subject to state violence, who have their own movements, their own demands, as political actors, right? He immediately dismisses, rather than saying, how can we talk to these people who are concerned about state violence in the case of Mark Dougan, right? And that was representative, in a sense, of the broader movement. There was this impasse between legitimate and illegitimate protesters that fell along the lines of race. That brings us to Libya, right? Libya was one of the prominent examples of the Arab uprisings of 2011. It was situated a little bit differently geopolitically. Whereas the leaders of Tunisia, of Egypt, of many other Arab countries that had protests against their authoritarian leaders were pro-Western leaders, right? They ruled because they were allied with the West. The United States, European countries sent them millions of dollars in military aid, propped them up. They weren't concerned that they weren't democratic. They supported them. Gaddafi had a different history. He had for a long time been a thorn in the side of the West, a critic, right? For many years, he was a strong proponent of Pan-African and Pan-Arab policies. He was trying to unite the African continent as a single political and economic entity so that they could better negotiate with Western powers in terms of trade deals, in terms of political deals, right? And he was very critical of Western imperialism. At the same time, certainly by 1999, 2000, he began to capitulate to the West. And part of this is a product of the fact that His government was accused for being behind the bombing of a Pan Am plane in the 1980s, something that he never wanted to admit to and which many people think is still a suspicious accusation. Nonetheless, the West imposed sanctions on his government and said, you did this, and until you account for it, we're going to impose sanctions on your government. So as a way to kind of make friends again with the West, he came over to their side and became a close collaborator by the end of his life, the last 10, 15 years, curbing migration to Europe, right? Limiting the flow of sub-Saharan migrants passing through Libya and going to Europe, heavily policing them. So he was, in a sense, in the West camp by that point, but had always been a kind of thorn in their side. So when protests kicked off in Libya, even though Gaddafi was more or less doing what the West wanted him to by that time, they knew that this was kind of an unreliable figure who for many years had been very critical of the West. And so here we get an example of a call by Western countries and by NATO to intervene and to support the uprising. Because even though it began as a series of demonstrations, like many of the other Arab uprisings, very quickly this became an armed struggle, right? The anti-Gaddafi fighters picked up guns to fight the Gaddafi government with force. And so Western countries, under the leadership of the United States and NATO, decided we're going to send in air cover and we're going to bomb Gaddafi's forces wherever we can to support these people who are having an uprising against them. Interestingly enough, another Arab country also sent support. I believe Qatar sent their air force to support. It's a bit ironic considering that Qatar has another authoritarian government that could have been subject to the same demands. But NATO allied with Qatar to support the anti-Gaddafi forces. And they were celebrated as democratic forces. But one of the things that didn't get touched on very much and was ignored by a vast majority of the press was the way that these anti-Gaddafi forces were also mobilizing against black people within Libya, right? At the same time the revolution was happening. They started to target black people in the same way the Golden Dawn was targeting migrants in the streets of Athens, claiming that these were African mercenaries who had been in line with Gaddafi and were fighting for him potentially. Now, Gaddafi had given refuge to a whole number of different African guerrilla movements, political movements, for a number of years, but there also were many black Libyans living in Libya, citizens of Libya, for a long time, right? There were migrant workers living in Libya as well, right? Nonetheless, many people at this time in Libya who were black were rounded up, detained, a number of them were lynched, and this then just fueled the need to flee the country across the Mediterranean as political refugees. But this went unnoticed by most of the Western press that was celebrating the example of the Libyan Arab uprising as a democratic movement for freedom and justice. One of the few people to comment on this was the anthropologist Jemima Pierre, who's up the road at UCLA. And she wrote a piece talking about race in Africa today, where she argues that the situation in Libya was marked by three powerful rhetorical projects that rotated on the axis of race. First, the rise of local protests against the Gaddafi administration was part of a season of revolution that began in Tunisia and Egypt, dubbed the Arab Spring by mainstream Western media. One could not be faulted, however, for assuming that this was also an African spring, since Tunisia and Egypt are on the African continent. So the erasure of Africa in these struggles. Second, the claim of African mercenaries worked against that of the Arab revolutionary. Africa and Africans were not only rhetorically removed from the Arab Spring, but they were seen as counter-revolutionaries. More importantly, and this is the third rhetorical project, African mercenaries invoked the worst of anti-black racial stereotypes, murderers and rapists. NATO's humanitarian intervention in Libya thus emerged in response to the perceived threat of black African savagery. So that brings us to our last case, which is the South African one, right? I argued earlier that in a sense, South Africa prefigured this turn to a populist authoritarianism, right? Forms of right-wing populism in other parts of the country. And there's many ways in which one can study the issue of race inside of political movements in South Africa. The one I want to talk about just briefly is one that doesn't often get discussed under that lens, and that's the issue of xenophobia, right? Unfortunately, in South Africa, despite the fact that the anti-apartheid struggle allied itself and received tremendous support from other African countries, right? South African activists went into exile. They trained in camps all over Southern Africa. They were given resources, support, training for weaponry in order to overthrow apartheid government. Other African countries boycotted the white South African government. Despite that history of Pan-Africanism, today South Africa, as one of the richer countries in the African continent, has attracted many immigrants from all over the African continent, and in their wake they've also fed into this broader xenophobic anti-immigrant hysteria, right, that we've seen really plague a lot of societies. And the ruling ANC has been very lukewarm in denouncing this. Oftentimes leaders have condoned it, added fuel to the fire, blaming the problems in the country on immigrants as well from other parts of Africa. And this has led to a kind of open season on migrant populations, most prominently in 2008, again in 2015. These were two big moments where there were massive attacks on migrant communities, right? Their homes were burned, their shops were attacked. Many of these migrants coming from Somalia, from Mozambique, from the DRC, Congo, from Nigeria, right, from Namibia. They might set up a small shop in a shack community as a way to make a living, right? And so these sites became targeted in these xenophobic outbursts. And many of them were even killed, necklaced in the same way that collaborators with the apartheid government were necklaced during the anti-apartheid movement. They took a tire, put it over your body, doused it with gasoline, and then light it on fire, right? So this was a problem throughout the country. Not only were their buildings attacked, but their people were also attacked. And what was notable about these attacks is that white migrants were not targeted, right? Oftentimes, people noted that there was a hunt for people whose skin was too black. Openly, this was the hunt, right? And South Africa has a strange history of viewing itself in exceptional terms in relation to the rest of the African continent, as developed, as civilized, as not a part of Africa proper. So sometimes when people go from South Africa into Mozambique, they say, I'm going into Africa, right? This is actually a racialized discourse, but one that is internalized amongst Black South Africans and directed at other Africans as a way to distance themselves from some more authentic expression of blackness that these African migrants are supposed to represent and which are clearly a threat, right? They're an outlet for their anger at being too poor. These people are stealing our jobs. They're stealing our women, right? The typical racist discourses that we see, you found also in South Africa. Here you have a protest by Nigerians denouncing the fact that despite this Pan-African history, this call for African unity, Nigerians are being attacked in Africa. Now, I want to point to one example that tries to diagnose this problem, which comes from a social movement in South Africa that I've spent a fair amount of time with. This is a movement called Abahlali Basemjondolo, and they organize principally in shack communities where people have no formal homes, they don't have access to land, they can't survive in the countryside, they migrate into the city and set up their own homes without formal water, right, without formal electricity. So these are tremendously impoverished conditions, but nonetheless, in these contexts, there have been some examples of really promising political mobilization, and Abahlali is certainly one of those. But these spaces have also been the center of the xenophobic attacks. They often start in these very same shack communities amongst the poorest members of South African society. And what Abahlali was arguing for quite a long time is that we have to be careful because the anger of the poor, when they're facing so much frustration, so much unemployment, right, poverty in these living conditions, that anger can go in many different directions. And it's emblematic of that split we're seeing around the world of an opening on the left, calls for greater justice and equality, and an opening on the right, vengeance, anti-immigrant, racist attacks against others. So they issued a statement in the wake of one of these attacks in 2008 saying, yesterday we heard that this thing started in Warwick and in the city center. We heard that traders had their goods stolen and that people were being checked for their complexion. A man from Ntuzuma was stopped and assaulted for being too black. We have been warning for years that the anger of the poor can go in many directions. That warning, like our warnings about the rats and the fires and the lack of toilets, the human dumping grounds called relocation sites, the new concentration camps called transit camps, and corrupt, cruel, violent, and racist police, has gone unheeded. So they're linking the horror that South African society expressed in the wake of these xenophobic attacks to the other warnings that they tried to issue with regards to the continued racialized impoverishment that they suffer. And on this question of neoliberal racism, they say, while goods and services are increasingly freed to move across spatial borders, that's one of the ideas of neoliberalism, open up your markets, right? Human beings, despite their conceptualization by economists as human capital, still don't enjoy such freedoms. It is time to ask serious questions about why it is that money and rich people can move freely around the world, why everywhere the poor must confront razor wire, corrupt and violent police, queues, and relocation or deportation, right? They're calling for freedom of movement of everyday people, of their fellow Africans. So to conclude, I'd like to read a paragraph from Tiffany Willoughby Herard's book, Waste of a White Skin, where she's trying to describe this broader global threat of race, what I've been calling a global threat of race, and why she thinks we need to use this broader global analysis that decenters the nation state. She says, I use the term global whiteness to denaturalize the existence, spatiality, and temporality of the white settler colonial nation, and to insist, as black radical movements do, that addressing racial politics as if it can be confined to national borders is a point of departure at best. Here I argue that racial politics and its border-crossing features help create and sustain mythic national borders. Thus, global whiteness and the mechanisms and processes by which it is sustained and mobilized can be better understood as the geographic contiguity that results from shared and enduring commitments to white nationalism, as well as attempts to deny those commitments. Indeed, the supposed national specificity of racial geographies turns out to be in fact porous, permeable, and mutually constitutive of what I call global whiteness. Thank you.